Today we're in lesson number 2 of our preacher training series where we're talking about how to use the Pursue God tools to preach a sermon at your church. And today we're going to cover lesson number 2. We're going to answer the question, what qualifies you to preach? Now, this is a question that may have crossed your mind, especially if you're a layperson going through this preacher training series. You didn't go to seminary and you're wondering, are you sure you got the right person? Remember, the Pursue God tools are designed to equip regular people, average people, to do ministry, even ministry from the pulpit. So let's talk about what qualifies you to preach. And we're going to have you answer 5 questions to see if you're qualified. Here's the first one. Are you connected to Jesus? Preaching in the early church was a function of spending time with Jesus, not of seminary training. And we see that here in Acts chapter 4, verse 13. It says, the members of the council were amazed when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, for they could see that they were ordinary men with no special training in the scriptures, and they also recognized them as men who had been with Jesus. Now look, I'm not trying to throw seminary training under the bus here. I'm really not. I'm seminary trained. I'm so grateful that I went to seminary. But in my own church, we have many people who never went to seminary, who have the gift of teaching and who are really good at it. And we think that that's a biblical thing. This passage right here proves Peter and John, they were regular, ordinary guys. They were fishermen just a few years earlier. But I love what this verse says. It says that they had been with Jesus. And that's the key qualifier right there. They'd been with Jesus, and that gave them confidence beyond their education. Here's the second question. Are you honoring God in everyday life? Preachers are qualified by solid character and sound doctrine. Now, you can find this all over the New Testament, but one example is Titus chapter 1, verse 7. It says, a church leader is a manager of God's household, so he must live a blameless life. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered. He must not be a heavy drinker, violent, or dishonest with money. I encourage you to read the full context for this in Titus chapter 1, or read the other lists of biblical qualifications for elders. And even though you might not technically be an elder at your church, when you're preaching, I think you should really pause and say, am I qualified? Do I lead in my home? Do I have a good reputation in the community? And make sure that you take this seriously. You don't have to be perfect, because if you had to be perfect, then no one would be up there preaching. But you should definitely read passages like Titus chapter 1 and make sure that you have solid character and sound doctrine. Here's the third question. Do you care about people? Godly preachers are not motivated by ego or financial gain, but rather by a desire to help people pursue God. There's a section in 1 Corinthians that addresses this very thing. And in chapter 13, verse 2, Paul writes this, if I had the gift of prophecy, and if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could move mountains but didn't love others, I would be nothing. Now, I encourage you to read chapters 12, 13, and 14 for the full context. But what's happening here is Paul is talking to a church where there's a lot of dysfunction. And get this, the dysfunction was all around the usage of the gifts. People wanted to platform their own gifts. And this is where I think it's so important for you to check your own motives in your own heart. If your goal is to get up there and to show off your great teaching gift, then I don't think you're ready. Your goal should be to love people and to serve people with your teaching gift. And so take a lesson from 1 Corinthians and the dysfunctional church in Corinth, and make sure that love is at the heart of your desire to preach. Here's the fourth question. Are you personally making disciples? You can't lead someone to a place that you've never been. Remember last time we talked about the fact that the goal in our preaching is to create more full circle followers of Jesus, people who trust Jesus, people who honor God, and people who make disciples. So look, if you're not actively in the game, making disciples in your life, in your world, then I think you're being kind of a hypocrite. You're not going full circle yourself. So how can you preach with the goal of helping other people go full circle when you yourself aren't doing it. In my own life, I'm discipling 3 different people, and that is outside of everything that I do as a pastor in my church. So I think it's important to ask yourself, am I making disciples? If the answer is no, then I think you should start discipling people first, and preaching can come later. Here's the last question, and this is pretty obvious. Do you have a teaching gift? See, while disciple making is a calling on everyone's life, preaching isn't. You have to be gifted for it. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians 12. Paul says, are we all apostles? Are we all prophets? Are we all teachers? Do we all have the power to do miracles? Do we all have the gift of healing? Do we all have the ability to speak in unknown languages? Do we all have the ability to interpret unknown languages? He says, look, of course not. I saved this question for last because I want to make sure that you talk about it with your mentor or with the group that you're going through this series with. Make sure that you have a basic gift. Now, you're of course going to grow in that gift. You're going to grow in that skill. We're going to do a little bit more training in the next lesson where we dive into the details of preaching a Pursue God sermon. I'm not talking about whether you're fully grown in this gifting. I'm just saying, do you have the basic ability to capture people with your stories? Do you have a good command of God's word? Do you have the gift of teaching? Because if you don't have the gift of teaching, then you shouldn't go on to the next lesson. But if you do have the gift, we'll see you in lesson 3 for a deep dive on how to preach a Pursue God sermon.